Yeah, it is quite unusual. We have, to be clear, seen Emmanuel Macron and other Pacific leaders and other French presidents in the Pacific before. In fact, it was a few years ago that Emmanuel Macron went to New Caledonia. But what's unusual this time is the duration of the trip and the fact that the president isn't just visiting French territories like New Caledonia, he's actually going beyond that. So for the first time, we've got a sitting French president visiting Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu as well. Now, this is pretty unusual, and I think it does signal, or at least the French government is keen to make the point that it does signal an expanded ambition on the part of France to really play a role in the Pacific beyond what it already does as a resident power. Now, the framing here is pretty familiar. The French, of course, have already stressed, or have always stressed, their strategic autonomy, even though, broadly speaking, they are far more closely aligned with the West and the United States in the Pacific than they are China. But still, Emmanuel Macron's office in the lead-up to this trip has been keen to emphasise that France can provide what they've termed a third way between the warring superpowers. He's also stressed, or his office has also stressed, that there may well be more commitments in the climate change space. France is already a pretty big player in terms of climate change mitigation, so we might see that expanded in the region, as well as when it comes to things like deforestation and attempts to try and curb that in countries like Papua New Guinea. So it's an interesting trip. It does involve a bit of signalling here from the French, and it will be fascinating to see what happens not just in New Caledonia, which is, as we'll talk about, grappling with its own particular issues and its relationship with France, but also what he lays out and does in countries like Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. Independent nations, of course, which have their own views on strategic competition and will no doubt be very interested to hear from Emmanuel Macron as well.
Yes, and of course, Stephen, it's not only the French president. We've got two very senior American politicians making their way to the region. What are they coming for?
Yeah, it's a lovely little distillation this week of the way that strategic competition is ramping up in the Pacific. One of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that that's demonstrated is this flurry of visits that we've seen over the last few months. And this week, not just Emmanuel Macron, but also Lloyd, the Defence Secretary, going to PNG, and Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, going to Tonga. Now, in Tonga with Antony Blinken, I think there's quite a bit of signalling involved here as well. The Secretary of State will open the United States' new embassy in the capital there. Now, that is one of a number of new embassies that have been opened or reopened by the United States as it moves to ramp up its diplomatic presence in the Pacific. In PNG with Lloyd, there's going to be a clear focus on that very well-known, rather contentious and potentially quite landmark defence treaty that was, or defence agreement that was struck between Papua New Guinea and the US back in May. The agreement has been signed, but it still has to be pushed through the PNG system. It might be vulnerable to a legal challenge. We don't know yet. And there's been quite a bit of pushback from the opposition, which is worried that this agreement, which potentially opens the door to a US military foothold down the track in PNG, might in some way endanger PNG's long tradition of independence and non-alignment. So I imagine that the Secretary's focus will be talking about how that agreement, once it's ratified, can be implemented, trying to take stock of its progress and to ensure that he can do everything that he can internally to try and encourage PNG to push it across the line. Yeah, 3 big visits in around 3 days. It's a neat distillation of the way that the larger powers, including outside powers, are increasingly looking at the Pacific with a very keen eye.
And of course, and indeed, China is one of them. And it's interesting that at a time we're marking 20 years since Ramsay, that special peacekeeping force, went from Australia to Solomon Islands, the political climate there is very, very different. And that is because of China and its ambitions in the region.
Yeah, that's right. 20 years from today that Ramsay began with the Australian forces, along with forces from other Pacific Island nations, landing in Solomon Islands to restore order. It's a landmark moment in Australian foreign policy, and one that has been marked in a few places, and of course, most importantly, will be marked in Honiara over the coming week. But look, I don't think many people in Canberra are feeling particularly optimistic about Honiara and about Solomon Islands right now, and that's because, as as you point out, over the last few years, there's been a new element injected into calculations, and that element is China. Now, there's no doubt that Solomon Islands is in a far, far better place than it was back in 2003, where it was basically on the brink of becoming something close to a failed state. But we have seen, since Ramsay's departure, 14 years later in 2017, we have seen violence and disorder rear its head once again, most recently 18 months ago, when Australia once again led an effort to restore order. And perhaps from Australia's perspective, even more worryingly, we've now had expanded police cooperation between Solomon Islands and China, with Manasseh Sogavare, the Prime Minister, openly warning that if Australia isn't quick enough to respond in the future, then he'll just pick up the phone to Beijing and bring Chinese forces down to help restore order. Now, that would inject a real note of chaos potentially into the situation, because you might see parallel command structures set up. You have the risk, however limited, of Chinese personnel potentially clashing with Australian personnel on the ground. All sorts of nightmarish situations could potentially present themselves. So Australia wants to do everything possible to preserve its position post-Ramsay as the ultimate security partner of choice in Solomon Islands, but at least with Manasseh Sogavare in power, that position looks shaky at best, and that injects just one more note of uncertainty into an already fraught and fluid landscape in Solomon Islands.
Really challenging time. Stephen, great to talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Beverly.